Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest Leader Talks webinar. I'd just like to briefly note that a handful of polling questions have been made available, and we ask that you please send in your responses to those within the next few minutes. I just lost my video. Oh, there we go. Okay. So tonight, we'll have the opportunity to hear from and engage with Dr. Mary-Wynne Ashford, a physician, author, professor, and celebrated peace activist who has played an integral role in the global peace and nuclear nonproliferation movements. Dr. Ashford is a retired family doctor and palliative care physician. She graduated from the University of Calgary's School of Medicine in 1981. She also earned a PhD on the prevention of adolescent violence and was an associate professor at the University of Victoria. Dr. Ashford is the past president of Canadian Physicians for Global Survival and past co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, an organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. For her work, Dr. Ashford has been awarded the Queen's Medal on 2 occasions. She's also been honored with the Gandhi Award from Simon Fraser University, the YWCA Distinguished Women Award, and the University of Calgary Outstanding Alumni Award, and is an honorary citizen of the City of Victoria, to name only a few of her many accolades. Her award-winning book, Enough Blood Shed, 101 Solutions to Violence, Terror, and War, has been translated into Japanese and Korean, and was the subject of a United Nations-sponsored conference at which Dr. Ashford was a keynote speaker. And now today, we are lucky enough to host Dr. Ashford as our very own speaker. So I'm sure I speak for us all when I say what a privilege it is. Welcome, Dr. Ashford, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love having the opportunity to speak to young leaders, and congratulate all of you on being Schulich Scholars. I have a couple of things to say. Before I begin, I want to recognize 71 years ago today, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb on Japan. The first one was on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945, and the second one on Nagasaki 3 days later. And this one was a 15-kiloton hydrogen bomb. So I'll get back to talking about that in a few minutes, but it has become relevant because in the past week, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, has said that she wouldn't hesitate to push the nuclear button should it be necessary. And Donald Trump has said in a rather confusing series of comments that he would also not hesitate to push the button. So it brings nuclear weapons forward in the agenda once again, and I will be addressing that. The main thing that I want to talk to you about today is not my own role, but rather the role of civil society over the past 30 years, because we have seen a global revolution in the role and influence of ordinary people in bringing about change on this planet. And I've had the huge privilege of being a part of that. It seems very exciting to look back and compare how things were in 1984 when I became an activist compared to today, 32 years later. So let me just start with looking at the 2 forces that are affecting the world today, 2 forces affecting humanity. The first one I would say is the forces of deterioration. That is to say, the collapse of the institutions that we have previously trusted, whether it's government or financial institutions or religious institutions. There is now a profound sense of mistrust, and this is not just in the West. This is worldwide, that people are questioning legitimacy of leaders. The leaders, in fact, are finding that the structures we have in place are simply not adequate to face the challenges that are in front of us today, from global climate change and the breakdown of the environment to the collapses of the financial structures that we have believed would work for us, and the new challenges of democracy in the face of the entanglement with big money worldwide. So these are some of the major things that we're facing. And on the other hand, we're watching a parallel development of the growth of positive factors in the world, the decline of war, the rise in the role of women all over the world, the education and the emancipation of women, leadership by women, the role of civil society in gaining a voice to become really the conscience for government and big business, so that ordinary people are now having the opportunity to constrain some of the actions of our leaders. We also have growth in the influence of international law and the potential that that is bringing. So let me go back to 1984 when I became an activist, and I'll just tell you a bit about the background of how things were then, because it's very difficult to imagine the pervasive sense of fear that we had in the 1980s. So I graduated from medical school in 1981 as a mature student. I moved to Victoria to do my internship, and I was then in a new relationship with a man named Russell, and we have 7 children between us, 4 of his and 3 of mine. They were all in their teenage years at that time, except one who was in her 20s. And we both really had our hands full. I was establishing my new practice and so on. But one Friday night, Russell was at the hospital delivering a baby, and my children were downtown with their friends. I came home late because I had done a house call and then hospital visits. Got home about 6:30, and it was pouring rain, cold December night. I looked in the newspaper as I was eating a sandwich, and I noticed that Dr. Helen Caldicott was speaking at the University of Victoria. And I had no interest in nuclear weapons, frankly. I hadn't even been following the political scene because I had been so busy as a medical student. But I thought, well, you know, I'd like to go and hear what a medical doctor does in the field of advocacy and so on. So I drove over to the university, where I discovered 1,200 people had arrived there before me, and all the tickets were sold. So a number of us, probably 50 or 100 people, sat in the lobby, the university center, on concrete benches and watched Helen Caldicott's speech on closed circuit television. I could not believe what I saw. When I was at university the first time, when I was younger, I was next door to Joe Clark's office, and Joe Clark later became our prime minister. And when I saw Helen's statistics, I thought, oh, Joe Clark would never have let this happen. There cannot possibly be 60,000 nuclear weapons in the world. It's so irrational, it couldn't possibly be true. It turns out, we know from more recent documents, that in fact at that time there were 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. At any rate, of those weapons, most of them were held by the Soviet Union and by the United States. And I've asked a question in the polling, do you know which 9 states have nuclear weapons today? At that time there were 5. The United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France. Today, in addition, we have Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So I don't know how you did on that poll, all of you, but I hope that you were aware of all of those things. The problem, the major problem, I think, really, is that at that time, 2,000 nuclear weapons are on high alert. Now it's 1,800 1,850, I think, nuclear weapons are on high alert, and they're on launch on warning. So that means that if, say, for example, Russia today launched a missile toward the United States, and the station in Colorado under the mountain picked it up on radar and said, yes, we are having an attack, before that missile landed, they would give the command to launch their missiles against Russia. And immediately then Russia would send another retaliatory strike. Nuclear weapons are the only thing today that can end life on Earth in an afternoon. And that's how it would happen. Whether you had a computer error on that radar machine in Colorado, or you had a drunk person or someone on drugs manning one of those stations on either side, or if it's launched by accident, which has happened, we could have nuclear war inadvertently. Also, when leaders begin to escalate their rhetoric by saying, yes, I would not hesitate to push the nuclear button, it makes the tension ever so much higher and accident ever so much more likely. There have been 5 very near misses in the past. The one in particular that I write about in my book is in the Soviet Union when Colonel Petrov was in charge of the response center in the Soviet Union, and all of their alarms were going off to say that there was a nuclear attack. Now, he knew that there were new satellites that had been installed, and he wondered if he had a computer error on his hands. And in the face of all of his superiors saying, launch, 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 he said, no, we have to wait, I'm sure this is an error. And with enormous tension, they waited another 5 minutes and found out that it was indeed a computer error. Another time, an error was when Norway launched a weather missile, and although it landed close to Norway in the sea, it had been picked up by Soviet detectors. So we really are living in a very dangerous time again. At any rate, I heard that part of Helen's talk, but the part that stays with me is the part I want to share with you now, and that is that if there were a nuclear attack, what would that actually look like? And she described what it would look like for us. At the University of Victoria, the Naden Naval Base being just under, I think, somewhere around 20 miles from the university. In the immediate center of a nuclear blast, the temperatures go as high as the temperature of the center of the sun, some 4,000 degrees centigrade or 7,000 degrees centigrade or close to 1,000,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything in that area is vaporized. Everything disappears totally. People, buildings, asphalt, cars, trees, everything that can burn. And a little bit further out from the center, more than, say, 3 kilometers, everything catches fire because the temperature is enormously high. And there is a massive firestorm that engulfs a whole area of about 7 kilometers in every direction. And that would be coming close to UVic by then. After that, there is a ring of destruction from hurricane force winds, first from the blast outward, and then as the blast rushes upward, air rushes back into the center again to replenish the air that's been blown out, and you get the hurricane force winds back into the center again. So people are killed not only by the immediate blast, but also by the debris that is thrown at huge velocities to them. So if I happened to be at UVic, I probably would be caught in the firestorm. And as I thought, I realized my children would have been in that central area where everyone would have been vaporized. My husband would have been in the area of the firestorm at the hospital. Both hospitals would have been blown up and burned up, with all the doctors and nurses there. If I happened to be out close to the ferry, which is further out, and I survived, I would walk out toward my car. There would be no power, no communications. Those are all blown out by the first electromagnetic pulse. There'd be no water, no running water. And I would go to my car having my kit in the back. I was a palliative care physician, so I had in my trunk my medical bag. And in the medical bag, I had enough morphine to get one cancer patient to the hospital, enough anti-nauseant for about 6 hours for that patient, 4 hours worth of pain medication, 6 hours of anti-nauseant, some antibiotics to cover one child with an ear infection, my stethoscope, which would not be of any use, blood pressure cuff, some bandages, maybe enough to bandage a cut arm or a leg, nothing of use at all to face what I would be facing. I would be looking back at my city in a fireball, a firestorm, with mounds of dead bodies everywhere, and those few people who survived staggering out, their skin hanging from them in sheets, their clothing burned off. no doctors, no sterile IV solutions, no hospital burn wards. Hospital burn ward usually has somewhere between 3 and 6 beds. So not no use to the tens of thousands of people. There might be a chance, I would think, maybe I should get some of these people who are critically ill but might survive, maybe I should get them out of here. Perhaps we could get them up to Nanaimo. The airport would have been destroyed. The bus depot would be destroyed. The roads would be destroyed. Cars would not start because the electromagnetic pulse destroys the starter of the cars. So there's nothing at all that medicine can do. And it was then that I realized I just can't hear this information and do nothing and be paralyzed. I went home, and by the time I got home and got to bed, I was freezing cold. I lay down. Russell had not come back yet. The kids had come back and were asleep downstairs. Russell came back about 3 in the morning, and he loved delivering babies. So he was really high on the experience of just having delivered a new life. He didn't even say anything, climbed into bed and fell right to sleep. While I lay there, absolutely frozen, paralyzed, thinking, what on earth am I going to do now? So I didn't sleep all night. I went to work the next day. I came home. I couldn't sleep the next night. And by the middle of the third night, I realized I had to take action, and I had no idea what to do. I was not an activist. I had no idea what to do. But in the morning at breakfast, I said to Russell and my kids, I'm going to have to do something about nuclear weapons. And I don't know what, but I guess I will start speaking or something. I don't know what. And my sons, who were in high school, said, well, it's about time, Mom. And I said, what do you mean? I said, haven't you noticed the posters that are up in our bedrooms? Well, I went downstairs and I saw here were U2 and Pink Floyd, all Crosby, Stills and Nash, all bands that were against nuclear weapons and had been doing the No Nukes work for a couple of years. So I had already joined the physicians movement against nuclear weapons just because the invitation came in my mailbox, not because I thought I would get active. So I phoned them up, met with them and said, so what do I do? And they all said, well, nobody knows what to do. We've never faced this before, but if you see something you think will work, then do it. And if you're asked to speak, always say yes. Always say yes because you are a doctor and because people will listen to you because you're a voice of science and a voice of reason. So I took that advice and began to become active. I spoke at the Peace Walk that year and went to my first International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War meeting. International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War was founded in 1980 by two doctors, two cardiologists. Dr. Lown in the United States, world famous because he's the man who invented the defibrillator, you know, the one that you put on someone's chest to get their heart started again. That's the Lown defibrillator. And Dr. Chazov, Yevgeny Chazov, was the personal physician to the head of the Soviet Union, who was Andropov at that time. Now, what had happened in 1980 was for 20 years, Lown and Chazov had already been collaborating as cardiologists do across countries. They had been collaborating on research into sudden cardiac death in young men under 40. Well, they were at a cardiology meeting in Philadelphia in an elevator that got stuck. So they were in there talking, and Lown said, Dr. Chazov, the biggest threat to the world today is not sudden death of young men under 40. It is nuclear war. And you and I have to take action against this. We need to found an organization of doctors to talk about this and to talk to world leaders to tell them in the event of a nuclear war, medicine has nothing whatever to offer. There is nothing we can do. And Chazov was quite taken aback, but he said yes, he would go back. He got permission from Andropov to join this group, and they met in Washington. I think about 12 people or 20 people that first time, and went on then to tell doctors in other countries about their movement to bring together American and Soviet physicians to talk together and say, look, it doesn't matter our political systems. Ideologies are irrelevant. What matters is the survival of humankind. So by 1985, I joined in 84, well, became active in 84. By 1985, I went to a meeting of about 450 doctors in Hungary and discovered it was unlike any medical meeting I'd ever been to. Medicine at that time was very hierarchical. And, you know, I was a family doctor, a woman, and there were specialists that really, it was a privilege to speak to a specialist, was the way that was regarded at that time. But at IPPNW, everyone was equal. Everyone was here because of a great passionate concern to save the world. So I can remember standing in line at the hotel, and an Australian anesthetist was beside me. And the man in front of us turned around and said, "Are you here for the IPPNW meeting?" And we both said yes. And he said, "So am I. I'm Jonas Salk." Now, Jonas Salk discovered the Salk vaccine, right? So the anesthetist shook his hand and said, "I'll never wash my hand again." So that was the kind of meeting that it was. And the sharing of information and the sharing of our terrible concern was so moving that it really gave us all energy to know that we weren't alone. I want to back up a little bit and tell you about what the world was like in 1984, because it was more or less the peak of the Cold War. Reagan was the president of the United States, and Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire and had made a joke, which turned out to be on camera, about launching missiles to the Soviet Union, and then he denied afterward and said, no, it was a joke. But the image that we all had of the Soviet Union was of robotic people, people with no feelings, subhuman kind of people who just did not have our sensitivities or our understanding or any understanding of world peace, that they were completely devoted to communism and wanted to rule the world and so on. And every image that we had seen on television from the 1960s on was of red square and black and white with a tank in the background and the commentator in the foreground. So to think of doctors meeting from the United States with doctors from the Soviet Union was just practically unheard of. I mean, we couldn't imagine it. Later that year, I went to the Soviet Union for the first time with a group of 9 other Canadian doctors. I was the only woman. And we met with doctors in Moscow, Leningrad, and Tbilisi. To begin with, when I landed in Moscow, I mean, this is embarrassing to admit this, I couldn't believe it was in Technicolor. It was, you know, the domes of the cathedral, St. Basil's Cathedral, it's exquisitely beautiful. It looks so much like Edmonton in October. The people were enormously friendly and so grateful that we had come to meet with them and talk about building peace. The more that we talked, the more we realized that the leaders were on a different plane from what the ordinary people were. Ordinary people want peace. We don't want to kill each other. And somehow we had to get that message across. It seemed very important to get the medical question out there and let people know, don't think that you can dig a hole in the ground and survive an atomic blast. You cannot. You will die, you'll be burned, you'll suffocate. Don't think that people survive in the immediate aftermath without getting radiation poisoning or genetic damage that will cause leukemia or other cancers later on. So starting from there, many people went back and forth to the Soviet Union. We, of course, met with television and so on when we got back to Canada and spoke about the Soviet Union. And I have to tell you, in those days I was afraid of public speaking, and especially, and doctors, and those of you who are hoping to be medical students, you'll probably resonate with this. It's particularly frightening to speak to a medical audience because when you're in medicine, you're really expected to know everything about the topic if you're doing a presentation. And I was just terrified when I spoke to my first medical audience, which was quite a large audience, because I thought they would ask me about the kinds of missiles or the kill range or the kinds of bombers or the treaties or something where my knowledge was very rusty. But instead, the whole question period was, were you followed everywhere you went? Did you ever get to speak to anyone privately? Did you think your phones were bugged? Were you searched everywhere? Did you have any freedom to move? All questions that I had been worried about before I went there. People in a general audience often had hostile questions. They often asked if I was a communist and what did I want to do? Did I want to cave in to the Soviet Union? Did I want to give up all of our weapons and be taken over? Those were typical questions. One in particular I'll tell you about, because I had by this time been studying some conflict resolution skills, and I learned to keep my mouth shut, which is not easy. But I was doing a radio talk show in Saskatoon where the question was whether Saskatoon should lift their moratorium on uranium mining. And the people were phoning in mostly to say, no, they should leave the uranium in the ground. But one man phoned and said, and very hostile, and said, you listen to me, doctor. I'll tell you where you belong. You just go and change yourself to one of those missiles in the Soviet Union, and they'll send you straight to the Gulag, and that's where you deserve to be. So I said, I think you must be talking about the women at Greenham Common in the United Kingdom who chained themselves to the American missile base. They chained themselves to the fence where they're protesting against the stationing of American missiles. And to be honest, I don't have that kind of courage. I admire those women, but I don't think I could do it. But what I can do is as a doctor, I'm privileged, as doctors are, to be able to talk to some of the world leaders. And my organization has met with Mikhail Gorbachev, who by then was the president of the Soviet Union. And he listened very carefully to what doctors had to say and wrote about that visit in his book Perestroika. So I said, I think we have more influence on Gorbachev in the same room than we do if we're protesting by chaining ourselves to a fence. And the man said, oh, well, thank you very much, doctor, and God bless you. And I never understood what happened in that little interaction, but it was a huge lesson for me not to argue, not to point out why this person was wrong, to listen, to agree where I could, and then just to say where I was coming from. This is all too frightening, and I'll just do the best I can. That's all anybody can do. And I'll interject before I forget about Gorbachev. I'll interject with a wonderful story about Gorbachev. After his leaving the Soviet Union and settling in Rome, he started hosting the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize in Rome to have a series of lectures and discussions about nuclear disarmament. And recently I was a part of one of those delegations to meet with him. And during the lunch hour, he told a story about when President Reagan first went to Moscow. And Reagan first berated President Gorbachev about the human rights record of the Soviet Union. And then he said, and you know, President Gorbachev, in the United States, we have freedom of speech. Someone could go and stand right on the lawn of the White House and yell, kill Reagan, and that would not be against the law. And Gorbachev said, Mr. President, that's interesting because it's exactly the same in the Soviet Union. Someone could go right into Red Square and stand there and shout, kill Reagan, and not be against the law. So, go back a bit because I've mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1985, by that time we had actually 200,000 doctors who had signed on to the call for abolition of nuclear weapons. Now, a huge number of them were in the Soviet Union, some over 100,000, I think, and others throughout the United States and all of the Western world. And we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because and Chazov, were bringing together American and Soviet doctors together to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Now, at the time of the presentation of the award in 1985, there was still huge hostility to the peace movement. We were all regarded as commies, commie pinkos, fuzzy-headed idealists. Many times I would face derogatory comments about my activities as a peacenik. Well, at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, the newspapers in Europe had said, KGB wins the Nobel Peace Prize. In other words, the Secret Service in Soviet Union wins the Peace Prize. So you could guess how hostile the press conference was. I wasn't there, but here's what happened. The room was full of doctors, about 50 doctors, and then a large press gathering. And as the press started out with their hostile questions, the television cameraman from the Soviet Union, from Gosstelradio, collapsed with a cardiac arrest. Van and Chazov flung off their jackets, and so did the other cardiologists in the room. Everyone started on CPR. The Norwegian doctors had the emergency response right there within minutes, and the man recovered while still in that room. He regained consciousness and was taken away by ambulance. Van turned to the, Van actually showed them the cardiogram from the ambulance and said, looking at this cardiogram, one cannot tell if this is a communist cardiogram or a capitalist cardiogram. We can't tell if he's free or if he's a prisoner. We only know that he's had a cardiac arrest and we all need to help. The press room changed completely after that. So that was a beginning of so many actions that I was able to take part in that transformed my life, because I met the most remarkable people ever. I mean, certainly I met many of the great people. I met Mother Teresa, I met the Pope and Gorbachev, of course, and Pierre Trudeau and so on. But I also met people from all over the world, people of enormous courage, just enormous courage in standing up to their governments and calling for social transformation. So let me stop there for a second. I'll tell you one more bit of information about nuclear weapons, and then I'll take some questions on the nuclear issue. At the moment, sometimes students say to me, why should we get involved in the nuclear abolition movement? Because you've been working on it for 30 years and you haven't succeeded. We have succeeded. We have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. As I said, there were 70,000 nuclear bombs in 1984. There are now fewer than 20,000. It's about 18,500. Unfortunately, more than 1,800 are still on high alert. And we've come so close on 2 different occasions, so close to having agreement on a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, or at least the beginnings of it. And it's been scuttled just at the last minute. But once again, we are very close, and I will talk about the 3 recent humanitarian conferences afterward. But let's take questions now.
Okay, sure thing. So if any scholars would like to either raise their little hand icon to call in with a question, or would like to send in a question through the Q&A and type their question, we'd be happy to take it. We do have one question that's already come in from Mary Kathleen. And she's wondering, what are the regulations concerning governmental response times to apparent nuclear attack? So I think she's getting at the question of high alert, and she's asking how quickly would those response missiles be sent?
Less than 15 minutes. And I'll tell you, the most chilling time was when Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Soviet Union, and he was known to be a chronic alcoholic. And he had that suitcase with the nuclear button. The Swedes especially were conscious, because they went back and forth to meet with doctors in the Soviet Union and now in Russia. And they said their concerns were just huge that something would happen if he made a mistake. So yes, 15 minutes response time, and that means that they do have to respond before detonation. We have called for them to wait until the first, if there is real attack, wait until the first bomb detonates and then respond, and respond moderately, and on the other side, the same thing. So it's called delaying the response instead of immediate response. At least that would give us a little bit more safety than we have now.
Do you think that that type of amendment to the standardized response would be a more realistic first step towards abolishing nuclear weapons than maybe asking everyone to disarm right away? Like, do you think that that would be the place to start?
We have said that for many, many years and got nowhere with it because they're not willing to say, no, we'll go off high alert, because it leaves one side or the other looking vulnerable. And at the moment, there's not good enough relations between the U.S. and Russia, between the leaders. But it comes down to the personalities of leaders in so many ways. Now, we were worried about Reagan, but Reagan actually made the biggest strides. He met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik in Iceland, and they were ready to work on the elimination of nuclear weapons, but their staff wouldn't. The stumbling block was that Reagan was in favor of Star Wars, you know, this missile defense thing where you would shoot down a missile in flight, and that was not realistic. So he couldn't hold on to that and still work for the elimination of nuclear weapons. So that fell apart, and that's a huge tragedy because those two men actually had a spark between them. They actually became fond of each other.
So do you think that stepping towards abolishing nuclear weapons will actually come down more to personalities than it will to policy or activism? Where do you think those lines are drawn?
Now about what's happening now, because this is the most exciting time in 30 years, really. Starting in 2013, the non-nuclear weapon states were absolutely fed up with the fact that there's been no progress on nuclear abolition, period, in all of this time. And in 2006, we have a statement from the International Court of Justice in The Hague saying nuclear weapons are not legal under international law. Nuclear weapon states must proceed immediately to nuclear disarmament, and nothing happened. So the rest of the world is fed up, and Norway in particular said, we're calling a meeting of those states who are like-minded to come to Norway, and we will discuss not deterrence and not security. We will discuss the humanitarian impact of nuclear war or the explosion of a nuclear bomb. And 130 countries went to Norway for that meeting. Now here's the role that young people played there. They met all of the delegates on the steps of the hall where they were meeting. Young people came with huge placards that said, "Thank you for caring." So the delegates really were immediately warmed by this response. The delegates then heard things like I have just spoken about, the medical consequences. They heard about the technical side, the verification that's in progress, and so on. At that meeting, and heard the humanitarian consequences from survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were so shaken by all of this information, they became totally determined to carry forward with movement toward a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. And then Mexico hosted the next meeting within the year. The same thing happened, but this time there was something like 150 nations. And then the most recent one was in Austria. And this time they ended up with a pledge. Let me just read you the pledge from that one. By the government of Austria, Austria pledges to cooperate with all relevant stakeholders, states, international organizations, International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, parliamentarians and civil society in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences. And within weeks, nations began to endorse that pledge, and 33 leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean signed up en masse at their annual summit. So that is continuing. Now, the exciting thing about this is that civil society played a major role in these humanitarian conferences, and it's an organization that young people can become involved in. In fact, 90% of the activists in ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, 90% are under the age of 30. So this is not a movement of my age group. This is a movement of young people with all of the energy and passion and determination to make this happen this time. The conferences sound to me just absolutely wonderful, and I wish, like anything, that I could still be traveling to go to them and just witness what's happening. This is more hopeful than anything I've seen in the past 30 years, for sure.
Oh, that's remarkable. We do have questions just flooding in from our scholars, if you would be willing to take a few. Sure. So maybe to start with, a quick follow-up from Mary Kathleen in regard to these peacekeeping meetings. She's wondering if North Korea has played a role and what their role has been, and specifically how they've been speaking about their nuclear weapons.
Well, I've been to North Korea twice. I've taken 2 delegations to meet with doctors there. It's extremely, extremely difficult. It's the most heartbreaking place to visit because the people are starving. The government has such rigid control and there's such fear. We did speak, we think, to doctors, but it's difficult to know if they were doctors. However, it's good that we spoke to whoever was listening and gave all of the information about the dangers and the impossibility of any kind of medical response. North Korea has sent delegates to our IPPNW conferences, usually 2 delegates and a translator. It's difficult to ever talk to them at any length of time. North Korea is gradually opening up, has sent in considerable amount of aid. Especially the doctors send in heavy-duty antibiotics when there's a crisis like the flooding and earthquakes a few years ago. But it's difficult to help, and it's difficult to know what impact we've had. We have given them computers in the hopes that they might be able to communicate, and we don't know yet even what's happened to those computers. But at least with computers, they are able to access Western medicine. They weren't able to practice Western medicine when we were there. They were using traditional Korean medicine and herbal cures and rarely doing surgery. None of their equipment worked because they didn't have enough electricity.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Elena. I will actually open up her microphone and let her ask you directly if you don't mind. Okay. Elena, you should be live now. Elena, are you with us? Okay, I'm not sure if we are going to be able to hear from Elena, so I'll just go ahead and read out her question on her behalf. She's wondering about the other states that have nuclear weapons. So obviously the non-nuclear states have done a lot of work and discussion, but she's wondering if there are negotiations ongoing in the nuclear states and what those are looking like.
There are not, and there is a conference in the disarmament conference in Geneva has had that supposed to be their mandate, and they have not even had an agenda for years and years. I can't think how many, 16 years, 20 years, something like that. They can't agree to set an agenda, and so people just sit there in Geneva and do nothing and are extremely frustrated. Now that has been circumvented because the General Assembly agreed that there could be the establishment of an open-ended working group. And that is like-minded states coming together to talk about these issues and start to do whatever we can do to progress towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. And if you follow that online, and you can follow it on the internet, it's Open-Ended Working Group, OEWG. I think you find that fairly encouraging. It's important that we are trying to step outside of the formal center of the United Nations because the Security Council has 5 permanent members, and they are the 5 original nuclear weapon states. And they will veto everything that comes up regarding nuclear weapons. So we have to go around them.
Of course. So as it stands, the existing nuclear states would not be considered like-minded states in the working group, and would.
No, the United States did come to the last of those humanitarian conferences and made a speech that was to do with deterrence and security and did not address the humanitarian consequences, and I'm afraid that their diplomat was roundly lambasted by the other delegations there who said that's not why we're here.
Yeah. Do you think we'll ever be able to find a resolution if, as it stands, there seems to be these two groups? There are the groups that don't have the weapons who are wanting to do all the work, and then there are the groups that do have the weapons who are unwilling to budge.
No, for sure, for sure. We're right on progress to have a treaty. Treaties are already being drafted and revised and discussed from all different legal points of view. And if we get a treaty, there comes a time when it becomes customary law, so that it applies to everyone, whether or not their weapon states agree or not. Now you can say, so they disagree, they keep their nuclear weapons. That changes when they have lost legitimacy as far as the rest of the world is concerned. So the point is to get the treaty and allow the changes to happen at will, because some of the nuclear weapon states, particularly I think India and Pakistan, would be willing to move on this. That if you look at the nuclear weapon states that have the most, it's the U.S. and the Russians. China has not a large arsenal, probably around 400 nuclear weapons, but they may be modernizing and getting more. And that's one of the things that scares us, is that the major nuclear weapon states are modernizing their weapons now. Instead of proceeding to eliminate them, they're changing them and making them smaller or more mobile.
Right. Okay, so just to jump back to one of your polling questions that you did put out to the scholars, I want to tell you what the responses were. So you asked, do you think that wars have been increasing or decreasing in the past 100 years? And 41% of our scholars said they believed they had been increasing. 34% said they believed they were decreasing, and 25% we had no response.
Okay. Okay. The interesting thing is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, which was the end of 1991, and we consider that the Cold War ended on December 25th of 1991, after that, the number of wars in the world dropped dramatically. So now it has decreased by over 95%. 95%. That's major wars and genocides. Now, a major war is defined as more than 1,000 battle deaths in a year, and it's between different countries. Internal wars and smaller wars have declined by at least 40%. These figures continue to go down in spite of the fact that we've got Syria and we've got Southern Sudan and so on, and these things are in the news all the time, and we think the world is getting worse and worse. It's not. It has steadily, steadily improved in this past time since 1991. The other interesting thing is that violence has gone down everywhere. It's gone down. Violence against women, domestic violence in the United States is down 60%. We don't hear that. We still think violence is a huge, huge problem. Why is that? Well, it's because, as far as the media are concerned, if you want to gain viewer attention, you use violence as the tool. And the newspapers say, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's how things are chosen to be on the front page. So we're inundated with this notion of violence, and so much of what we watch on screen is violent that we believe that the world is a more violent place. It isn't. It's a less violent place. And again, I want to come back to the role of women and the role of civil society. I should just say briefly that I use the work of Nicholas Perla about civil society and its role, and he describes three pillars to society. There's government, there's the financial sector, and then there's the culture or the civil society. And when all three are powerful, civil society is the conscience of the other two. And that's when you get the most healthy functioning of governance. We know that in countries where women have no rights, that those countries are much more likely to have an internal war. In fact, in a country where women do not have control over their fertility, where they are not, in other words, they're not free to choose who they marry or how many children they have. They are not able to vote, they're not able to hold public office, and they're not able to work outside of the home. Those countries are 30 times more likely to have an internal war. So the education and emancipation of women is an extremely important part of peace and disarmament. I was going to say something else about the question. Well, it's gone for the moment, so we'll come back to that.
Okay. Well, on the note of what you told us about how...
I know it is. Talking about how the world itself is changing massively with global revolution. 85 dictators have been toppled now in these recent years, and that's since 1991. 85 dictators, and all but a very small handful were toppled nonviolently, just by people standing up and saying, "We've had enough, clear out," and the dictators flee. Okay, now back to you, sorry.
Not at all, of course. It actually leads in very well to a question from Arthur. He's wondering would nuclear abolition have an effect on conventional warfare in light of the fact that wars have gone down so much in the last 100 years? Do you think that the abolition of nuclear arms would have an effect on the rates of conventional war? Would they increase? Would they decrease at a greater rate? What are your thoughts?
No, I don't think that it would be picking up the slack by using conventional weapons. No, I think that as nuclear weapons are abolished, what goes along with that is a building of cooperation and trust between nation states. The thing is that nation states are so interlinked now, they can't afford to fight each other and destroy each other. They can't destroy the property. It's a huge, massively expensive of human life and resources. Now, that being said, it's also a major source of income, particularly in the United States. Weaponry is their major export. So to talk about the United States disarming means major recalculations of their economy and shifting those industries toward peaceful purposes. And God knows there are enough things that we need to save the world from climate change that we surely are not going to have to rely on making weapons to be able to survive.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I just want to ask, in light of issues like climate change and gender inequality and world hunger, why do you think young people now should throw their weight behind nuclear nonproliferation and the global peace movement in lieu of any of the other issues that the world faces?
Let me just say once again, the only thing that can kill everyone on the planet in an afternoon is a nuclear war. And we are so close to it now, and you can read William Carey's new book about it. He thinks that the threat is greater now than it has ever been. Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has set the clock to 3 minutes to midnight now, which midnight being the end of the world. It's so urgent that I'm begging you to pay attention to this. Now, I'm not saying that you have to become an activist like me, devoting every minute of your time to nuclear weapons. What I am saying is tweet your friends, raise their awareness, especially of ICANW, ICANW, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Take some of those simple actions. We're going to win this by social media. That's how this campaign is going to take over, is that young people are going to say, this is crazy. This is something that we can stop right now. We can stop the trillions of dollars being spent on weapons, and we can move on with problems that are more pressing for your generation. So that's what I would say. Then I would say, in the rest of your time, get working on climate change and the social justice issues. They all link together. Everything links together. The problems of climate change are so linked with poverty and lack of development and lack of justice for refugees and migrants. All of these things are basically the same issue of, are we ready to share this planet? Are we ready to live cooperatively? Are we mature enough to say, we don't have to fight, we can share? And that's what it comes down to. It's very, very basic. And you can work on these at any level. You can do it in your own community. You can teach children's classes about nonviolence and bully proofing, or you can work as I have with with leaders going shopping to governments, writing papers, and so on. There's a range for everyone. But I'm just saying, please don't believe that this issue has gone away. This issue has not gone away.
So on that note, we do have some questions coming in. People are asking, what can we do? How can we use our resources and our time to help this cause? And I think maybe in light of all the information you just gave us, maybe the best question to ask you would be, what can we do tomorrow? If we want to start tomorrow, what would be one step we could take to try to make a difference?
Step number one is I would go to the website of icanw.org and look at what actions are being taken all over the world and see if there's one of those that really speaks to you that you can join in on. There are simple things like writing letters to your member of parliament to saying, I've just become aware of this. I'm going to, tonight, write a letter to the Prime Minister of the UK and say, you've said you're ready to push the button. Are you aware of what will happen the minute that you push the button and launch a nuclear weapon, that within 15 more minutes, the United Kingdom will no longer exist, that millions upon millions of people will have been burned to death, millions and millions more will die of radiation poisoning. The cloud that will go up, the cloud of black soot, will circle the earth, blotting out the sun. We'll have crop failure. We'll have famine all over the planet. And you would go down in history for that if anyone happened to survive to write history.
Wow.
But you have to write those letters, and you may think they have no effect. I'll tell you another story about Gorbachev that he writes about in his book. He said there were two things that really affected him. One was his meetings with the doctors, but the other was the hundreds of thousands of letters he received from little children saying, please don't have a nuclear war. And they profoundly affected him. So that's where I say the person is so important. We shouldn't think of a leader as being some kind of robotic head of state. They are not. They are human beings.
Thank you. So what Joan is wondering is whether there has been any response from the medical community if in the event that, the Prime Minister of the UK did push the button, or in the event of a nuclear war, has there been any response from the medical community in terms of researching potential treatments?
No, there is nothing we can do. I mean, if you're faced with 1,000 patients, who, let's say that you have 1,000 people who have survived, and they're in the midst of piles and piles of bodies, and you're a doctor, you have no hospital and no medications and no IV fluids and so on, you can go around and you can spend 1 minute with each patient and see everyone, if you sleep, you can see them all in 1 week, and you'll have done nothing, and most of them will have died. So that's the medical response, that's reality. And yes, we have told that many, many times. The problem is that many people have come to office now who are younger, who did not learn all of this as we did by being so frightened. They have not been exposed to knowledge of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah. We actually had a question on the topic of Hiroshima and Nagasaki from Jessie, and she's wondering if those bombs hadn't been dropped by the United States, do you think the outcome of World War II would have been different? I think what she's asking, do you think it was some sort of a necessary evil? What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. I'll refer you to historical documents. Truman's diary shows that he knew that the Japanese emperor had already approached the Russian diplomatic service to say that they were ready to surrender. So Japan was ready to surrender, but they went ahead and dropped the bombs. So that, I don't think there's a dispute about what's in Truman's diary. What people can dispute is whether that was a genuine response that Japan was ready to surrender or not. But I think that it's my personal view that the bombs were overkill at that point. There's only a few minutes left, and if you don't mind, there's a couple of things that I still want to say about successes of civil society, because when I started this work in the 1980s, it was very unusual for any non-governmental people to be in the corridors of the UN, holding meetings and meeting with diplomats and so on. Now it has become essential, and when conferences are held, there is an enormous presence of non-governmental experts, and that's changed everything. That has really meant there's no vested interest of a nation state in a non-governmental group. They're coming forward and saying, this is the social issue and this is what we have to do. It frees up the discussion to be much more highly principled. And so we've had the influence of civil society resulted in the World Court being asked to give an opinion about the legality of nuclear weapons, and they said they're not legal. The landmines campaign was led by civil society. The campaign to establish the International Criminal Court was led by civil society. So we have been hugely successful.
Huh. Yeah, it sounds like one of the big takeaways from this is that individuals, when we come together, are very, very powerful.
Hugely powerful, yes. Yeah, don't ever underestimate it.
Well, we have just endless questions to you, Dr. Ashford, but I think that we are running out of time. So I would like to leave you with one and maybe hear your perspective on something a bit broader. And that is, do you think we will see the end of war in our lives as young people?
I think you will. At the rate that the world is changing now, and particularly with the increasing influence of women, yes, I do think war will stop being the answer of first resort when there's a conflict. I think we're beyond that now. And I think that the changes that we're seeing in human populations saying, we don't want this anymore, especially millennials, say we don't want power and greed to be ruling us. That's not where we are. Yes, I think those are big changes. If people want to forward me their questions, I'd be happy to answer them individually. And you're free to hand out my email address if you'd like to do that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will. I'm sure people will be very eager to have their questions answered. But with that, we won't keep you any longer tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Ashford, for speaking with us. I'm sure many of us will come away from this, and you just might be our Helen Caldecott. So.
Very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay. David, do you want to maybe come on and give us a little bit of a close?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ashford. It's been a really unique opportunity for all of us and a fascinating and thought-provoking leader talks, to say the least. I hope everyone has been able to attain some invaluable information that will inspire you to emulate Dr. Ashford's passion for activism and social change for the betterment of society by leveraging her STEM background as a medical practitioner. So thank you again, Dr. Ashford, and thank you to Alysha for doing a wonderful job again as our moderator for this Leader Talks. And we couldn't have done it without you, of course. So I just want to wish everyone good luck in their summer ventures as they quickly and sadly are winding down, and you'll be transitioning back into your fall semester mode. But we encourage you to make every effort to get in touch with your Schulich Leader Squad captains in order to get ready to foster some unity amongst your university squads at the beginning of the fall semester. If you have any questions for me, you can reach me by email, and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. So wishing everyone a wonderful evening, and thank you again to Dr. Ashford and Alysha for conducting this really great Leader Talks.
Thanks to you.
Okay, I'm just going to log off now.